Oh, hey, how's it going? Welcome. I'm Keith. Nice to meet you. Welcome to the Nostalgia Bay. How can I help you? Well, we have a wide variety of retro games in stock right now. Most of it is Nintendo, but we also have a little bit of Sega and a little bit of PlayStation. So what exactly are you looking for? The NES. Excellent choice. Can never go wrong with NES. Of course, you do have to make sure that everything is clean in there because sometimes it has a hard time reading cartridges. You gotta sort of flick it to the side as you push the cartridge down. I'll show you, actually. So, here we have the NES. It opens up like a VCR. Oh, VCR? That is, see, before we had DVDs and digital, we had big tapes to watch movies in. We put them in the side like this and press them down. That was Nintendo's design choice because it was right after the crash of 1983, the video game crash in the States. Virtually nobody was buying video games, so the video game market cratered because greedy publishers were throwing out shoddy games left and right because Atari and other companies didn't really care about the quality. That's why in a lot of old Nintendo and Sega games they have the official seal of quality. They make sure that the games are good before they allow release on their platforms, which is really nice. So take Super Mario Brothers 2, for example, which isn't even Super Mario Brothers 2 originally. It's Doki Doki Panic because the actual Super Mario Brothers 2 was deemed too difficult for Americans. So they didn't release it in the States initially, and instead reskinned Doki Doki Panic as a Mario game. But I've beaten the real Super Mario Brothers 2 once. So what you gotta do, you load it in, you press it down, and if it doesn't read it properly, at least for this NES, you press it to the right, like this. You hold it to the right, and you power it on, and you should be good to go. It may take a few tries, but you're there. But yeah, it sounds like a pain, but it's worth it because the games on this thing are phenomenal, and the feeling of playing on the actual hardware, whether you grew up in that era or not, is amazing. And I can tell you because even though I am old enough to have played an NES when it was still in its prime, I was barely old enough, and I didn't get into gaming until I was roughly 7, when the Super Nintendo was almost out of its prime. But I still love this thing. It's one of my favorite systems ever. It has a port for an RF switch, which I really don't recommend using. It's that old cable that you plug in the back of the TV from back in the day. It's one metal pin for your picture and your audio, all jumbled into one little metal pin. And the picture and sound quality is horrible. So if you can, use this instead. Composite. Audio and video are separate. Of course, on later systems, they have 3-way composite and sometimes 5-way component. 3-way composite that has one for video and left and right for audio, all separate. But for this one, there's one for video and one for audio. It's mono. So it only projects out one speaker, which in those days it made sense because TVs were one speaker, mono. But in later days, they were stereo. So this isn't exactly practical either, but it's the most practical output you're going to get out of the actual NES. But we do have other systems that you might be interested in as well. Of course, the successor, the Super Nintendo. As the name suggests, it was made to be a supercharged version of the NES. You got a power and reset button that aren't exactly buttons you press, you slide them instead. Click, 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 and a spring-loaded reset button. Very tactily satisfying. As a kid, and even sometimes as an adult, I've fidgeted with the reset button when the power was off many, many, many times. And it still works. And we got our eject button. And of course, to demonstrate the cartridge, we got Super Mario World. And how could I not use Super Mario World as the example? This game made me a gamer. This game defined my life. Place on top, just like most retro consoles, these cartridges, you place the cartridge on the top, press it in, and then you flick the power on, and you're good to go. And the eject button, you were able to see it be pushed all the way effortlessly before. Now there's a little bit of tension because there's a cartridge on top of it. There's little prongs below the cartridge that push the cartridge up when you press the eject button, like so. Just like that. And nice and slow. I'm being kind of quiet because a friend of mine is visiting and he's sleeping in the other room. It was a long, long trip here. But yeah, there you go. Super Mario World, highly recommended. If you choose the Super Nintendo, I highly recommend Super Mario World. Can't recommend it enough. In fact, I may play it tonight. Sega. This baby right here was possibly Sega's biggest threat to Nintendo ever. Nintendo pulled through, but this baby was no joke back in the day. Back when it came out in 1989, there wasn't a Super Nintendo yet, so this 16-bit console, the Sega Genesis, known as the Mega Drive outside North America, was a beast, going up against the 8-bit Nintendo. Sega even put out a commercial, Genesis does. You can't do this on Nintendo, Genesis does. And that caught fire because so much you could do on the Genesis that you can't in a million years do on the NES. Could do on the Super Nintendo, but not the NES. So Genesis was your only option at that time for a couple years. And here in the States, Genesis was arguably Sega's biggest success. There's actually a few models of the Genesis. This is the first model. Another one that we used to have in stock was the Model 2, which had a more square shape to it. And it had press-in buttons for both power and reset. But here only reset is that way. And you have a power switch, like the Super Nintendo does. This is very, very retro looking. The color scheme, like these little slits with red in it. That was very common back in the day, but you don't see that a lot anymore. And unlike most other consoles, this thing had a headphone jack and a volume control for it. That's only on the Model 1. That feature was removed on Model 2 and 3. It's so cool. Can't do that on Nintendo until the Wii U and Switch came out. Not including handhelds. But you get my point. And much like the Super Nintendo, you load a cartridge in the top. Take Sonic the Hedgehog right here. Which, surprisingly enough, the movie they made that came out this year, Sonic the Hedgehog, was actually really good, in my opinion. I wasn't expecting much, because most video games, or movies based on video games rather, aren't that great, but Sonic the Hedgehog was a huge, huge exception. I bought it on YouTube as soon as it came out. Saw it in theaters and then bought it on YouTube, and I've seen it a good few times. And I don't even watch movies that often, to be honest with you. Yeah. But unlike the Super Nintendo, the Genesis does not have an eject button. You have to pull it out with your hands like most others. And with this model, it takes a bit of force. That's something that they fixed with later models. But still, it's very satisfying to put a cartridge in, flick the game on, and you're off to the races. I couldn't say enough good things about Sonic the Hedgehog. Yeah, a lot of their games later on had a lot of glitches because Sega always wanted to meet deadlines when they were approaching a Sonic anniversary, but the ones that weren't necessarily rushed, the ones that don't have a lot of bugs, are amazing games. And the ones that are with a lot of bugs could have been amazing games if they weren't broken. But if you like high-speed platformers, Sonic is your guy. The PlayStation. This little darling right here is a gem. It's beige like a lot of 90s PCs were. And it used discs rather than cartridges. And the discs were really cool. Let me show you why. I have here The World Is Not Enough. Fun fact, I am a huge James Bond fan. But I will say, this game wasn't bad, but it's not one of my favorites. I do think it's worth playing though. But I do like the N64 World Is Not Enough a little bit better. They are two different games that follow the storyline of the same movie. Interestingly enough. I'm not sure why EA decided that, but they could have easily done that. I know the PlayStation is 32-bit and N64 is 64-bit, as the name suggests, but they still could have done it. Just like Tony Hawk. But here's why the PlayStation discs were so cool. Check this out. the back of the disc is black. And that design choice apparently was solely to look good. And it does. Nothing wrong with the shiny, rainbowy thing that most discs do, but I absolutely love the look of the solid black background of PlayStation discs. They ditched that in later PlayStation consoles, but this is a classic look and feel. And of course, you just put the disc in. It'll spin around once you start it. Close it. Yes, I pressed the open button as I closed it so it doesn't make too much noise. Press power. And then you get a classic PlayStation screen. I know I'm such a dork, but I don't care. You'll understand once you see it yourself. It's an amazing intro. Probably my favorite intro that any console has. That or the Dreamcast. Both of them are really phenomenal intros. You got your reset button right here. And of course the open button to open the lid. And take out the disc. I can't get over how cool this is. Now, of course, because the PlayStation runs on discs, it won't save your data in the disc. It just has the game in there. So if you want to save your progress, you need to get a memory card. 1 megabyte, which in 1995, that was huge. It's nothing today, but trust me, the games you're going to play on here and the save data you're going to play on here, 1 megabyte will be plenty enough for that. You just load it in the slot here above the controller. The controller goes here. And voila. Your games will be saved there. And of course there's another memory card slot here, in case you want to transfer data from one card to another. Ingenious. And here we have another one of my all-time favorite systems. The system I probably played the most in my life. The Nintendo 64. So many phenomenal games came to this system that, in my opinion, hold up very well today. It had 64-bit architecture, which is why it was called the Nintendo 64. It was the most powerful system for its time, hands down. It had 4 controller ports, which at the time was like, what, 4 players at one time? Like, today we have games where so many people can play together at once, especially online, but back in the mid-90s, 4 players at once wasn't even a thought. So when this came out, when I saw there were 4 controller ports, I was floored. I was blown away. It still used cartridges, unlike its competitors at the time, the PlayStation, like you just saw, and the Sega Saturn. The Nintendo 64 still used cartridges, which there was a pro and a con for that. The pro was that you didn't have to deal with load times. Everything was instant. You slow the cartridge in, and data is transmitted instantly. Whereas with a disc, it has to spin around the lens, like looking for where it needs to go physically. Whereas it's all electronic here. So that was a plus for cartridges. But the downside was, back in those days, flash memory was much more limited than a disc. Not the case today, but back then, yes. So, amount of storage space on an N64 cartridge was far more limited, which means a lot of third-party developers could not put their big games on these cartridges. That is why Final Fantasy VII is a PlayStation game. It was originally going to be an N64 game, but because it was such a big game and they can't fit it on a cartridge, Squaresoft was like, can't do this. Going over to PlayStation. And it became one of the most successful games of all time. So, Nintendo missed the boat with that one. But it is what it is. At least somebody enjoyed that in Sony. Now, this right here is Star Fox 64. Just a few days ago, Rick May, the voice of Peppy Hare in this game, passed away. So in his honor, I've been playing this game quite a bit. It's such a fun game too. It's very well known for its witty one-liners. I absolutely adore them. And the gameplay is phenomenal. It's an aviation shooter. A lot of clever mechanics and all that. And like the other consoles you saw other than PlayStation, you load up the cartridge like that. Flick it on, and you're good to go. But unlike the Super Nintendo, see, like the Super Nintendo and the Sega Genesis, the power button was flicked on and off like this. The reset button is like this, like the Genesis had, like the PlayStation had, like the NES had. Super Nintendo's was up and down, but this one is a button you press inward. And this part I find particularly interesting right here, the memory expansion slot. Now, if you got an N64 back in the day, you got what was called a jumper pack loaded in there. It was the RAM, the random access memory. And for some later games, like Donkey Kong 64, Majora's Mask, Zelda Majora's Mask, that is, you needed to replace it with the expansion pack. This expanded your RAM, hence the name. That allowed you to play games like that. Those games require the expansion pack. Some games don't require it, but it's highly recommended. Like, they're limited without it, like Perfect Dark. Not all features are available on Perfect Dark if you play the jumper pack. If you want the full game, you need the expansion pack. There's no reason not to have an expansion pack in your N64, by the way. Every game plays 100% if you have the expansion pack. Let's lift the expansion pack out to take a look at it. Very classic look. There's a little pad on the top sticking out from it. It's a little mini cartridge, so to speak. But that's your RAM right there. The N64 behaved almost like a PC. Like you could expand one of the parts. And that was really cool. I almost put that in backwards, or I did put it backwards. But yeah, there you have it. That's the Nintendo 64 right there. Sega. We got another Sega system here. This was another one that blew my mind. The Dreamcast. This was revolutionary. 128-bit. The graphics were seemingly photorealistic for its time. Looking at it now, when you compare it to modern games, not even close, but back then, dude, this was it. Sega paved the way for consoles to come. Now, you have 4 controller ports, just like the N64. But it wasn't as known as the N64 for 4-player gameplay. Probably because, unfortunately, after a couple of years of it being on the market, it was discontinued due to lack of sales. And that's a shame because it was such a great system. But by then, Sega had a terrible reputation for the mistakes it made with the Saturn, among other things, but especially with the Sega Saturn. We couldn't even get our hands on a Sega Saturn, to be honest with you. Otherwise, we would. But, much like the PlayStation, you load a game disc at the top, like a CD player. This is Sonic Adventure. This started an array of 3D Sonic games of this style. This was the first of its kind in the Sonic series. So, just like the PlayStation, you take the disc out. It doesn't have the back isn't black though, like the PlayStation is, but that's okay. It still looks nice. You load it in here. Close the lid. Power on. And of course, press this to open. Look how smoothly it opens too. So elegant. Can never go wrong. And it has a triangular light on the bottom that lights on when you power it on. And it looks so cool. It looks so cool. It also has an Ethernet port. It was one of the first consoles to connect to the internet. Of course, the online capabilities of 1999 were nowhere near what we have today. But this started a revolution. And we have AV out. The video and audio goes out of here. It could use an RF switch, which again I really don't recommend. Composite or VGA. I highly recommend going with VGA because you could get a VGA to HDMI converter for a modern TV and it looks amazing. Like, seriously. That projects the true image of the Dreamcast and it actually looks gorgeous. You wouldn't think because it's such an old system, but I'm telling you. The picture quality potential with this for a 128-bit system is actually pretty damn good. Granted, the graphics itself will look like a retro console, but it will look sharp. So I highly recommend it. So there you have it. Those are some of the systems that we have. Any of them interest you? Great. The NES, Super Nintendo, and Sega Genesis. You will not be disappointed. I may be a little bit biased. Those are my 3 favorite systems, actually. And I think you are going to have one hell of a time with those. Great. Do you want to pay with cash or card? Card, okay. All right. I will ring you up. Okay?